So I'm Brian Nelson. I work for National Parks and Wildlife Service in the Science and Research Directorate, as we're called now. And I'm the invertebrate ecologist. I have responsibility for information on invertebrates in Ireland, mostly on the European species. But what I'm going to talk about today is the invertebrates in the burn. And not necessarily European related, but the importance of the burn for invertebrates, and hopefully by the end of it you'll maybe have a different appreciation of why the burn is so important for this group of animals, which to me are the most important part of the burn. The reason I come to burn is for the insects. It's not sexy. There's no equipment. It's just your eyes, a net, maybe a moth trap. Well, a moth trap is essential for the moths, but we don't have, unfortunately, high tech equipment. So it's really feet in the ground is what it is. And that's not quite sure whether this is actually running right, but hopefully it will behave itself. So what I'm going to talk about is where and what is the burn. Now that may seem a strange thing, but everybody's got their different definition of the burn. Eamon refused to talk about the limestone. I'm going to refuse to talk about the shale. That is not the burn. And who, what, and why? The people that have come before. Not very many people, but it's important to acknowledge their contribution. And also explain why we really know very little about the insects that burn until very recently, and the current state of knowledge, and I'll address gaps and questions. So I will admit to a family history of the burn. This book here is written by my brother Charles. He was a botanist at the National Botanic Gardens, long retired, but he wrote that book with Wendy Walsh. But he absolutely refused to mention anything about insects in it, despite me telling him what he should do. I think he mentioned slow worms or something like that. I can't honestly remember what animals he talks about. But basically, he doesn't talk about the animals. And that unfortunately is a running theme through a lot of the books. And these are all very good books. I'm not trying to disparage botanists or people who write journal accounts. Though I don't really understand why you would link the burn and Connemara together at all. Two absolutely diametrically opposed areas, but they did. And then we have the recent book by David Cabot and Gordon Darcy's book, and there are various other books. And they all, when you read those things, I know geology is extremely important. Geology probably doesn't get really very mentioned at all, but they all go on about the flora, and this phrase has a unique flora that is internationally renowned, as if that is the only thing that the burn is famous for. And Eamon has brilliantly demonstrated that the burn, even though it's the shale bits of the burn, are important for other things. I would say that sentence that phrase is much more important. The fauna and flora that is internationally renowned, and hopefully by the end of it I'll explain to you why that should be what they should be saying. Sorry, not too far, but too sensitive. So times have changed. If you go back and look at the old accounts of the burn, we've got that famous quote that I don't particularly want to go into, but Cromwell's general. And then in 1700 there are accounts of caves that talk about the wild people in the burn. It's actually quite. If you ever find that one, there's a kind of I think it's Kiltoran Cave, written in the 17. It's a letter from somebody in 1780. He's quite disparaging about the people. He says they're quite pleasant, but they're a bit wild. And then in 1838 you got this account, James Fraser, which is from this book. They all had these very grandiose titles in those days, going through Ireland, descriptive of scenery, town, etc. he talks about the burn, and he does rightly point out that the burn is so totally different from the rest of Ireland. I mean, when you get here, it is absolutely unique. But he goes on about it being destitute of herbage and presented to the eye an arid, cold, and joyless waste. Well, I think that is so totally wrong. When you come on a day like today, and we had a conference here in August last year at the Michael Cusack Centre in the middle of a heat wave. It certainly wasn't cold. It's not joyless, even when it's raining, you're still finding things. Anyway, he also says unchanged by either summer's sun or winter's cold. Vaguely, but it does change a lot. And when you get to see this in Muckanallock, in the southeastern part of the Burren, what I call the Burren, I mean that certainly isn't joyless to me or particularly cold looking. But everybody has their own impression. So what is the Burren? We all know where the Burren is in terms of Ireland's geography. But the definition of the Burren is then becomes slightly different to lots of people. There is no fixed boundary except a geological one. But then you've got a problem in the eastern side where it ended. It covers the karst landscape, 60% of which is limestone pavement, so most of it is bare ground. And that's comparable in size to most of the European karst areas. So you go to southern Sweden, you go to Estonia, you go to Croatia and Slovenia, where the karst comes from. The Burren is comparable in size to a lot of those areas, and there's not many habitats or places in Ireland that you can really say that about. Most of our habitats are quite restricted, but the Burren provides something that is large and extensive and true landscape. And most of the Burren is quite high, so this area here, it's the higher end, is up to 200 metres. But you've got this area in the east, which has got all these lakes. And that's quite lowland, and it's climatically warmer because it's more sheltered from the westerly winds. And this is the area here that's sort of contentious: is this Burren or not? That comes out in a minute, and particularly this area here, these Burns. The limestone is still there, it's much more fragmented habitat, but those often provide some of the most interesting habitats from an invertebrate point of view. And these lakes and turtles. And then 1,500 hectares is protected by the Burren National Park, which is mostly in this part here. But the early attempts to define the Burren, and if you go into the botanical thing, this boundary here, Webb's boundary, so that's Professor David Webb, who's a very eminent Irish botanist, and he really is the person that you credit probably for the ecological study of the Burren, because in the 1960s he persuaded the British Ecological Society to have actually a fund for research in the Burren, and that funded a lot of the work that came, people from Britain particularly, came to the Burren in the 60s and 70s to study the fauna, because it was a calcareous grassland habitat. They could then compare it with calcareous grassland habitats in the rest of Europe. But a lot of that work was initiated by Professor David Webb, and he came up with this boundary, which he published in a paper. So it follows the limestone boundary, and then you read the paper. He then gets a bit vague, and he says it follows a line up to the coast of Kilbarrack. But what that line is not quite sure, because it doesn't quite follow the county boundary, and, particularly down here, it's very vague. He does include the lake habitat, but most of the early work in the Burren fixated on these areas up here, around Ballyvaughan and the west. East was ignored, which I'll come to whenever we're talking about the insects better later on. This is the Burren programme, what is now the acres that was mentioned in the last talk. So that includes shale areas and goes out to Ardrathan, Gort, and Christian Ruan. This is the geopark area, which again extends further into the shale, and I think you take the county boundary as the boundary here. I've now created a totally new area for insect recording because I'm creating maps. So basically I take the limestone boundary to Lough-Inch-Quin, so it's defined geologically, and then I just use roads to get down to the M18, and I take the M18 and the railway line up to the river at Crockwell, and then the coast. So that's how I define the burn from a proposed new publication I'm going to do on the Lepidoptera of the site. And it includes, particularly, I want to it includes that southeastern lowland pit gorge. It includes all the SACs, which are there's a few SACs down here, which are in the on the karst. There are Arddrahan grasslands again, and in terms of their fauna, those have a lot of similarities to the burn. And the wetland habitats, I will stress, they are part of the burn because the water that goes into those lakes comes off the burn in many cases, as far as we know. So they're absolutely integral to the burn, and Webb Lowy included those things. Most people tend to ignore those in the early periods, which is very unfortunate. Again, as I'll talk about. So early recording. I'm not sure when the first geological work done in the burn was, but certainly it was 1700. I think there's botanical records in the burn in about 1600 from memory. I think gentians were noted and things like that. But I think you're trying to find the first insect record in the burn. The first one I can find is actually in 1895. In the turn of that century, the late 1800s, 1890s, through to about 1906, the last one, there was a series of meetings promoted by the Irish Field Clubs. Irish Field Clubs were very active in natural history at that time. There was one in Dublin, there was one in Belfast, there was Limerick, Cork, various other places. Those were the four majors. They all came together every 3 years, and they had a what they called a triennial meeting. And the 1895 meeting was based in Galway. So they all relied on trains and then local transport when they got there. So it was important that there was a train to the main location of going to. So that's why they're based in Galway. Their main work was in Connemara, but they spent one day in the burn. So they came on the burn Saturday the 13th of July. They left from Galway and they sailed across Galway Bay in steamer to Ballywan, and then they were met by a famous botanist called Patrick Kelly. He took some of them around the local area, and they did a bit of transport. So basically they're based in Ballywan. They all went westwards towards Blackhead, which was totally the wrong direction, but I can understand why they did it. It's a very impressive scenery. But when they were sailing across, they said there was a morning of driving mist, great massive vapour that still hung over the higher summit. So it was like this. And that's not a day to come looking for insects. And though there were a lot of entomologists on that trip, they found very, very little. The report of the meeting reports very, very few species. So it was obviously an awful day. I'm not surprised it put a lot of people off because they don't seem to have ever come back to the burn. This chap particularly, J.N. Halbert, who for the first, he died in 1934. He was an entomologist in the National Museum. He never seems to come back to the burn since. So though he did collect a lot in Ireland, the burn doesn't figure in his period. And I think one of the reasons for that is that there was no trains into the burn. A lot of these people did rely on trains to get around. And actually for the first 30 years of the 20th century, cyclists were entitled to half-price rail travel. They had a little card that said they were scientists and they were entitled to half price, which was a great thing. I wish they would come back, but it doesn't apply anymore. I think that is the main reason. We forget that we're so used to going around cars and things like that in the roads that transport into Burren was probably a limiting factor, and that's why a lot of people didn't come to the Burren again. So 1922, is another significant date. There was actually a visit recorded in 1913 by a chap called 1914, Charles Langham came in. Now he lived in Tempo, which is the county I come from, County Fermanagh, and he drove down to Ballyvaughan with his wife and his gardener, or his man as he called him. And his man did his collecting and brought back some finds to Langham to identify. And he did record some nice insects. But just to recount the trip, so he says he took 4.5 hours to drive from Tempo to Ballyvaughan. Well, I live in North Armagh, and it took me 4.5 hours yesterday to drive. Not that far, just maybe an hour's eastwards of Tempo, but the time to take the burn hasn't shortened much of that time. Anyway, so in 1922, a very significant find. This butterfly here, the pearl border fritillary, which is on the wing at the moment, was recorded for the first time at Cloncoose by two botanists, and they recorded it in abundance. But that was the first time that butterfly had been seen in the burn. In 1924, another very young Irish entomologist, Snell Fox, spent a week in County Clare, and he certainly visited that Cloncoose site where the butterfly was. But again, he was restricted by train, so he got a train to the Hinch, and he only recorded really in that area. He didn't, for example, see a very common bumblebee that's in the burn, Bombus sylvarum. So it indicates he didn't actually do very much work in the burn. So basically, we're only getting snippets of information up to 1924. In fact, even up to the end of the Second World War. In 1950, we jump to then. This book was published by Praeger. Now, Praeger is held up as being the preeminent Irish naturalist of all time, and he undoubtedly was a very good naturalist. He wrote an awful lot as well. I think he was a geologist, originally, but he became a botanist, and he certainly was without equal in terms of what he did in terms of covering Ireland for plants. But I don't think Praeger really was very interested in animals. But he wrote this about the bird in 1950. The fauna, not yet fully examined, offers little of remark, and that's all he said about the animals in the burn. And then he also made this statement about the turloughs. Said the animals in the turloughs, and these are the vanishing lakes, have not been examined, so I don't know how you can say anything about them. But the abrupt change in water level would not seem to be favourable to the presence of any varied or characteristic fauna. That is almost totally the wrong, absolute opposite of what is true now, because it is the abrupt change in water level that does create an extremely distinctive fauna that is of very great interest and is one of the most important aspects of the burn. So why Praeger was extremely unfortunate in his timing was, and he obviously didn't know this, in 1949, an entomologist, Stuart Wright, was on a botanical trip to the burn. They stayed in Ballyvaughan, as far as I can tell, but I'm not exactly sure where he made this discovery. But he found this animal here, the burn, what is called the burn green moss. He wanted to call it the clava, but that was resisted by lots of people. But when he discovered this by day, resting on bracken, he described it as, and he didn't have a clue what it was. It wasn't, there weren't very many moth books about it, but certainly didn't figure this one. So he sent it over in a matchbox to this man called Eric Classy in Britain, and Eric Classy eventually found out by visiting the British Museum that it was this moth called the burn green, beautiful green moth. And you just wonder why did nobody ever see this thing before? Did anybody ever see this thing before? Because it's actually quite common, but you do need to see it at night time. But Wright happened to see one by day. One of the few people actually to have said that. It is actually quite hard to find in the day. but if you have lights, it does appear. But that was the thing that has really opened up the burn to the study of insects, and why Prager's unfortunate timing a year later wrote that thing about the fauna. Well, there was the thing, because the burn green is only found in Britain and Ireland in the burn. The paper that announced its discovery had the wonderful title of Calamia tridens, which is the scientific name, new to Britain. And you know, even when you read the text, you realise, oh no, they're talking about Ireland here. They're not talking about Britain. But anyway, we'll have to forgive those people. It does happen even more recently than that. But that's what that discovery did. Was it came at a time when transport was coming more easy. Moth traps had been developed, particularly by a man called Robinson, and he developed a new type. There were generators. They could run lights away from electricity points. They could get there on their place to stay, etc., etc. Classy organised a trip in 1951 with the Robinson, who invented what's called the Robinson moth trap, with generators. They came over in Bentleys, and they counted quite, even though they're only 17 years ago. They seemed like a totally different era. They talk about their trip across. But they were coming across because they wanted to find this moth. They wanted to work out why this moth was here. Because it was in the west of Ireland, and why was it nowhere else? And then since then, we started this era of entomological recording. So, and Webb's wasn't directly related to that, but Webb, his ecological studies, I think, grew out of that great interest, because people in Britain were becoming interested in the environment. So we have, sorry, these are all scientific names, but we have all these groups of people who came to study these particular bits of fauna. So Mike Morris, who's still alive, came and he studied the froghoppers and things of grasslands, and did some of the really important ecological work. Another group of bugs here, with flies. Again, O.W. Richards, he was the British Museum expert in flies at the time. Still have other people coming across moths as go on, butterflies, dragonflies, water beetles, lots and lots of groups. Some subterranean fauna is probably the most recent one. Again, I'll touch on that a bit later on. So all these people have come looking for the groups, and really they were finding things that had not been recorded before. There were no previous records of any of these species. So some of the notable species have been found. I've referred to pearl-bordered fritillary, the burn green 949, and the brown hair-streaked butterfly is quite common in the burn, but that was only recognised in 1970. The Irish annulet is another moth that only occurs in Britain and Ireland in the burn, and that was discovered in 1991. And one of the reasons why it was overlooked by the people who came in the 50s, 60s was that occurs around the eastern burn, around the lakes. Two dragonflies discovered in the burn. This one here, which is the picture, Irish damselfly, was only discovered in 2011. Several flies. This thing here called Sarcophaga discover. It's a predator of snails. Only occurs in the burn in Britain and Ireland. There's no British records of that. This hoverfly was described from a burn specimen. And this other thing, Doris profuges, is called the phantom hoverfly, because it's extremely elusive. There's only been there's one sighting in 1962, and then someone running Mallows traps more in the Eastern Burn in the early 2000s, Tom Giddings. And I saw one last week, which I think is only the second live one I've ever seen in the Burn. So it's a very elusive thing. A couple of beetles, again, which don't occur in Britain. This one associated with Turlough, this one associated with Marl Lakes, and then various other groups. And just these last two, this thing called Tanimastic stagnalis is a species of the Turloughs, well, not the big trout, but temporary wetlands. Doesn't occur in Britain. It's got a very Western European distribution. Hasn't been seen since 1970s. It's a species that really we would like to find again. It seems to be it lives in temporary water bodies that don't have any fish, so it then goes into senescence. It must live in the soil, and it appears randomly over time. So it can go maybe 20 years before one is found again. This thing called Micronervis laruthi is one of these species found in this new fauna that's only been looked at recently. It's the groundwater fauna. So this is a species that lives deep underground, comes up whenever it floods, and you actually pump it out. You pump the groundwater out, and these things appear in it. This thing was first found in Belgium, and then was found here in the Burren. And there's a fauna that's perhaps there's more species waiting to be found. But it's associated with very poor, very base-rich water on the ground. And there is one endemic species that probably survived the glaciations as well, deep underground. So this graph just shows you the moth recording over the period. So from 1905 up to now, you can see there's a bit about the 60s, and then low level, and then a great increase since. So a lot of people are coming to the Burren to record moths. Another group of insects just again show the historical period of recording. So a bit of recording here in the southeast Burren, and then gradually over time, getting more records. Each dot record represents where the species have been recorded. So over time, getting more and more records. This is the butterfly distribution in the Burren. The redder the square, the more species recorded, and the areas where high diversity of butterflies occur here, in the central bit around Clúchus, the lakes, a bit up around Ballyvaughan, the lower stands out the coast. But generally, there's a lot of gaps still, but the key message from that is this area here, which is what the botanists would probably tend to ignore at the Burren, is actually, from an animal point of view, the most important. And that's because it's lowland, it's warm, and a lot insects need warmth, and for the life cycle they need a bit of warmth. If we go and look at the red-listed species in Ireland, and you look at the number that are in the Burren, in many groups, you've got over half of the red-listed species are actually from the Burren. So in total, 50% of all the Irish red-listed species occur in the Burren. So the Burren is the single most important area in Ireland for threatened species. And then we have this group of species which I've touched on, which are species that I call Ireland-only species. And they're species which occur in Ireland but don't occur in Britain, or don't have established populations in Britain. And if you look at the distribution of these, you look at all the invertebrate species, so that's all the, and there's about 300 of these species. You look at the plants, and the plants are often shown as this Lusitanian flora. So plants which occur in southwestern Ireland and Spain, most of them are introduced. And that's the distribution of plants. So they're concentrated in Kerry, Connemara, bit in the Burren. But the invertebrates are largely concentrated in the Burren. There are a few species which occur throughout Ireland. But the Burren is the single most important area for that group of species, and particularly grassland, but also wetland species. And you wouldn't think of the Burren as being important for wetlands, but it is. And again, another feature which a lot of books will talk about is the Burren is a northern and southern mixture, great mixture of northern and southern species. Well, as a paper I found recently by a mammologist said, you go to anywhere in the world, you can probably say that about everywhere, apart from the North Pole and the South Pole, maybe. But yeah, anyway, for the Burren, we have species like the Burren. This is the Burren green, so this is the world distribution of the Burren green. This is Burren distribution, so it occurs here in the north coast, and then occurs in the central Clúchus area of the National Park. And that's the distribution in the world. So the burn is actually bang in the middle of its global distribution. There is a dot in Britain, by the way, and there is one record from Britain, but it was an immigrant moth, because the food count of the food count is Sesleria blue murgrass, I think it's called, and that occurs in the burn, it doesn't occur in the site here, so that's almost certainly an immigrant moth. But it's a Central European species. So climatically, the burn is not unusual. The Irish damselfly, which occurs in the burn, is again absent from Britain, but widespread in North and West Ireland. It's mostly a northern species. It occurs actually right across Asia. So it's here in the burn, roughly in the southern part of its range. This species is called Eurycercus glacialis. It's a little arthropod, lives in freshwater, a water flea. There isn't a dot mark for Ireland, but it occurs here in Ireland, and it's virtually on the southern edge of its range. The Irish amulet, as I mentioned, another moth again, there's no dot shown here for Ireland, but occurs here. We're bang in the northern edge of its range. So there you go. The animals have this strange northern-southern mixture. So I'm on my last slides now. So in summary, and the botanists will go on to say that it's a strange mixture of species from Arctic and Mediterranean that applies exactly to the invertebrates. It's the most diverse and species-rich fauna in Ireland. So if you look at the group of insects that include the butterflies and moths, there's 1,350 species in Ireland, and there's nearly 1,000 of those that are recorded just in the burn. In the burn, not just in the burn, but 1,000 of those species are recorded from the burn. And I've shown you a 50% high proportion of species that are threatened occur in the burn. The majority of the species that confined to Ireland, that were written in Ireland, occur in the burn, and some of those are genuine endemics, only found in Ireland. And there's still more to find. I mentioned that phantom hoverfly that I saw. That same trip, which was last week, I got a new water bug to the burn, first record from County Clare. And these discoveries are being made all the time. And one thing I'm not mentioning in this talk is the burn is mostly bare ground. That, of course, doesn't have any plants, and it's open water, it doesn't have any plants either. But those habitats are used by the invertebrates. In fact, they are probably the key elements for the most interesting insects in the burn. So you've got the bare ground, which heats up very rapidly in the summertime, and that allows a lot of species which are southern to survive here in the burn, further north than most of the rest of the range. Insects also need access to bare ground to hibernate, so it's very, very important. And a lot of them are predators, so they can hunt over bare ground. And then in the water, the critical aspects of the water environment in the burn is that it's very, very low nutrients, and it's crystal clear water, and there's no fish. And fish are obviously predatory, so if you have lakes that have no fish, the invertebrates then take over. And I didn't mention one particular water beetle, a thing called Oxybius nielseni. There's only 7 sites known in the world for that species, and 6 of them are in Ireland. One of them's Lochara in County Mayo, but the rest are all in the burn. So we do have some species that we have the global most important population. But if you then look at the protected species in Ireland, the marsh tillery is the only one which is present in the burn. So most of the burn insects are totally unprotected, apart from the fact that their habitat is recognised. But then I've just made that point that most of the habitat that's important for the invertebrates actually lacks vegetation. Vegetation is what determines the habitat categories, so there's a bit of a dichotomy here. So I just want to, hopefully that's given you a bit of an introduction to the invertebrates, and as I say, more is to be found. Surprises always turn up in the burn, and it's just a wonderful place to come. Thank you very much.